Okay, so what do organisms do that don't use oxygen? How do they make ATP? So we talked about cellular respiration, and this is it's an aerobic process, meaning that they have to use oxygen in order to make ATP in this way. So if there are organisms out there that don't use oxygen, they're called anaerobes, and then there are other organisms out there that can do both. They can use oxygen to make energy, or they can live without it. So let's talk about these terms here. So the word obligate aerobe means that you must use oxygen to survive. Okay. The word facultative kind of means that you can go both ways. So facultative anaerobe means that you can use oxygen when it's present, or you can ferment. You can not survive, not use oxygen to make ATP. Okay, so you can do both. So facultative anaerobes, some yeast. Okay, yeast that is used to make bread, but also it can make beer and wine. That's a facultative anaerobe. So it can use oxygen when it's around oxygen, and it prefers to use oxygen. But if you shut it off away from oxygen, like when you make beer, you put the yeast inside of a liquid and there's no oxygen there, right? So it's going to ferment to grow and make energy, ATP, but without oxygen. All right. So we're going to talk about fermentation or anaerobic respiration. So if in your notes, it's Roman numeral 4. Number 1, anaerobic respiration is a process to get out energy out of molecules without oxygen, right? That's what anaerobic means. Many different organisms use fermentation to survive, like bacteria and yeast. Organisms that only use oxygen are called aerobes. Okay, that's the word we saw here, aerobes. Organisms that do not use oxygen ferment are called anaerobes. So I don't have that word here, I just have facultative, but if you're a microbe, a bacteria, and you die in the presence of oxygen, there are some out there, then you are an anaerobe. You don't like oxygen. And then I go on to say in the outline, some organisms like yeast can do both. They can do cell respiration when oxygen is present and make ATP with oxygen in the same way that I just outlined, or they can ferment when oxygen's shut away, right, or not present, and that's facultative. So let's talk about fermentation. There's a lot of different kinds of fermentation out there in the world. Depending on what the microbe is and what the cell is, it can actually do different processes to make energy without oxygen. So as a general rule, when things are fermented, when sugar is fermented, you can make different byproducts. So the result is either an acid or an alcohol or a gas. And those acids, alcohols, and gases can be different kinds. You can have oxygen gas, carbon dioxide gas, sulfur gas. You can have different kinds of alcohol. You can have ethanol, isopropyl alcohol, different kinds of acids, acetic acid, lactic acid. But it just depends on what is doing the fermenting. Okay, but again, the whole idea behind fermentation is to eat, to have your sugar, and to make energy, ATP, but in a way that doesn't use oxygen. So it's a different kind of process than cell respiration. So let's take a look at the rest of the outline here. Number 2, right? Many of these byproducts are used for us for food production. All right, so let's take a look at our pictures here. The yeast, as I talked about here, right, is used to make alcoholic beverages, so wine and beer. There are certain kinds of bacteria out there that are used by the food industry to make the desired product in food. Like there's lots of fermented foods out there. Beer and wine obviously are fermented, but also yogurts. So if you look at this yogurt, you see down here at the very end of your yogurt container where it says L. acidophilus and B. bifidum. those are two bacteria. And the bacteria are going to eat the lactose or the sugars in milk, right? They're going to break down the sugar. And instead of using oxygen and going through the whole cellular respiration pathway, they're going to break it down to some other organic byproduct. And the byproduct used in yogurt is lactic acid. And that's what makes yogurt sour. If you have like, you know, the Dannon and Yoplait yogurts that are on the market are super sweet because they add a bunch of sugar to it. But if you just bought like plain unsweetened yogurt, it's really sour because that lactic acid is what creates the sour taste. There's another kind of bacteria that helps to make Swiss cheese. So this is a fun thing to think about. So when you have these holes in Swiss cheese, why are they there? The bacteria used is going to be coated in all of this milk, right? So there's bacteria, here's bacteria, here's bacteria, and they're going to cover the milk, cover the bacteria in this milk, right? So the bacteria are going to be sealed away from oxygen. So oxygen that's outside can't get in, right? It's blocked from getting inside the cheese. So these bacteria are going to ferment. They're going to ferment the sugars in the milk. They're going to create, as a byproduct, gas. So these little guys are stuck in the milk. So when they make gas, they make a big bubble of gas around them. Here's another big bubble. Here's another big bubble. So then when all the liquid becomes cheese, what do you have? You have holes in the cheese because it's the gas that built up when the bacteria were fermenting. Okay, so gas is our byproduct of fermentation. This last example, our own muscles. So when you are running, this guy's running a race, let's just say it's the marathon, there's a time when maybe your muscles you're asking your muscles to work and to contract and to make yourself run, but maybe that muscle cell for the moment has depleted all of its oxygen. So the muscle cell, it's waiting for more oxygen, but it can't wait and stop working. It has to keep working. So your muscles will actually undergo anaerobic respiration or fermentation, and it'll use the sugar that's in your muscle cells, break it down, but without oxygen because your body just hasn't got the oxygen yet. So your muscles can do fermentation as well. So let's take a look at, and then I do have in the outline, the muscle cells, the byproduct is also lactic acid. So when your muscle cells ferment, it makes this lactic acid, and then that's what some people think that it makes you sore. So the acid builds up inside your muscles. It's a toxin. It actually, it's not very good for your muscle cells. And then it can cause that sore feeling the next day. So let's take a look at lactic acid fermentation. So you're going to want to know the ins and outs of lactic acid fermentation as well. So what's our in? It's glucose. Here we go again, right? There's our sugar. Now we're going to undergo glycolysis. I made a big deal about this in the first part. Glycolysis is an anaerobic process. It does not use oxygen, right? So there's no oxygen required for glycolysis. And remember, the end of glycolysis is pyruvate. So we went through the whole process. And also remember, glycolysis made 2 little ATP molecules. So there's your energy. Okay. So now, what do we do with pyruvate? So since we have no oxygen, it does not go on to the citric acid cycle or the electron transport chain. That doesn't happen. So pyruvate, through fermentation, gets turned into some kind of byproduct, okay? So some kind of organic byproduct. And so that's going to be this lactate. Lactic is another word for lactic acid. So lactic acid is made with fermentation. And so you're going to just sort of shuttle around your electron carriers. So it's a really short little chemical reaction, isn't it? Glucose. So again, what are your ins? Input is glucose, okay? Your outs will be some energy, some ATP, net energy. And also your final out is going to be some kind of byproduct, the lactic acid. Okay, so glycolysis is being used here. All right. So that's lactic acid fermentation. So what does this is your muscle cells will do this, and also some bacteria. The lactobacillus bacteria that's in your outline, that's the bacteria that's used in the yogurt. So if you look at this yogurt again, there's a little tiny L right there. That stands for lactobacillus. Okay. Now let's do alcoholic fermentation. So the only two fermentations you're required to know is alcoholic and lactic acid. So let me show you just a very slight difference. We again start off with glucose. We undergo glycolysis. We get our 2 ATPs. We make our pyruvate. That's all normal, right? That's something that you should know. Now, instead of one step to lactic acid, there's 2 steps. So the first step, the first step is here. We're going to form an intermediate called acetaldehyde. That's not important for you to know. But in that first step, we're making carbon dioxide. This is the gas. This is why your wine, that's why your beer is bubbly, because you're making carbon dioxide gas. I was just going to say wine and beer are bubbly, but not all wines are bubbly. So some wines, they actually let the bubbles escape. But the bubbles are natural process they're made in the process of fermentation. So you're always going to get a gas. Whether it's in the final product or not, that's up to the person making the wine, if they want a sparkling wine or if they want a still wine. Okay, so our first byproduct is made here, our gas. And of course, our second byproduct is made here, the ethanol. So we have an organic byproduct of ethanol. So ethanol is the kind of alcohol that we can tolerate. Please don't drink any other kind of alcohol, like rubbing alcohol you buy at the grocery store, which is isopropyl alcohol, will kill you. So don't do that. All right, so what we have here is a gas and an alcohol. So when you look at your products of fermentation that I have in bold, this is an example of an acid being made, your lactic acid. This is an example of a gas being made, and this is an example of an alcohol being made. Okay, so that is basically it. So let's compare and contrast our fermentation process and our cellular respiration process. Fermentation is a partial breakdown of sugar. It's not a complete breakdown. Cellular respiration is what we consider a complete breakdown of sugar, because glucose comes in, and then what do you get out of it? Your end products are CO2 and H2O. So this is as small as you can get in terms of breaking down glucose. The partial breakdown of sugar in fermentation is because you get this organic byproduct, such as your acids, alcohols. Okay, so you didn't break down the sugar all the way, it just became alcohol or it just became lactic acid, okay? Fermentation, you only get 2 ATPs per glucose molecule. So think of that, so you have 1 glucose molecule. If it undergoes fermentation, the most you can get out of that is 2 ATPs. For that same glucose molecule, if you could use oxygen, you get a lot more ATPs, right? 34 ATPs. This number changes slightly depending on how you do the math. Anywhere between 32 to 34 or 36 is what I've seen. So that's a lot more ATP. So this is much, much more efficient. Of course, fermentation has an advantage because you can do it without oxygen. This one does require oxygen. And fermentation, since you only need glycolysis, right? That first step in cellular respiration, glycolysis, this happens in the cytoplasm. So that's why the fermentation only takes place in the cytoplasm, because of glycolysis. For cellular respiration, glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm, right? But then we have our final 2 steps in the mitochondria. So the citric acid cycle, remember that was in the matrix of the mitochondria, and the electron transport chain, remember that was on the inner membrane of our mitochondria. So we really need that mitochondria for the last cellular respiration steps. All right, here's a concept check. In both types of fermentation we discussed, so this is alcoholic fermentation and also the lactic acid fermentation. What is the correct answer? So if you paused it and thought about it, your answer should be all the above. Okay, all the above. Critical thinking. So which statement is correct? only heterotrophs require chemical compounds from the environment. Is this true or false? So this actually is a false statement because heterotrophs, which are consumers, require to eat organic molecules, right? We have to consume our organic molecules. Autotrophs, even though they don't require organic molecules, they still require input from the environment, right? They still require water and CO2. So that's a false statement. Both heterotrophs and autotrophs require chemical compounds from the environment. Letter B, cellular respiration is unique to heterotrophs. This is also false, okay? Because if you go back to the very first slide of this chapter, you'll see a picture of plants and also a picture of animals. And you remember how I said like the photosynthesis and cellular respiration, they're linked. Okay, there's that cycle. Plants can photosynthesize as well as undergo cellular respiration. So plants, what they do with photosynthesis is they make their own sugar. So they make the glucose. Instead of eating the glucose, they make their glucose. But how do they use their glucose? Well, they need cellular respiration to break down the glucose into ATP. So plants will have both a chloroplast that helps them undergo photosynthesis, and they will also have mitochondria to help them do cellular respiration to break down the glucose. Okay, I hope that's really clear. Plants have an extra organelle. Plants make their own sugars with photosynthesis, then they break down the sugars into ATP with cell respiration, just like we do. The only thing that plants do extra is that they can create their own sugar. Animals or consumers or heterotrophs use cellular respiration because they eat. They don't have photosynthesis because we consume our organic sugars, okay? Hopefully that's clear. All right, letter C, only heterotrophs have mitochondria. So if you understood my explanation of B, this is a clearly false statement because autotrophs, which are plants, also have mitochondria. Letter D, only autotrophs can live on nutrients that are entirely inorganic. Yes, okay? So our photosynthetic autotrophs can live entirely on inorganic CO2 and H2O, plus, of course, energy from the sun. All right, and that's it.